Hello everyone, my name is Darla Saunders, and on behalf of the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation and the Canadian Rivers Institute, we would like to welcome you to today's webinar. The series is made possible in part thanks to the contributions of the Government of Canada. For today's webinar, we're extremely lucky to be hosting Wendy Monk. Wendy is a research associate with the Canadian Rivers Institute, Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Management at the University of New Brunswick. She's working with the Mactaquac Aquatic Ecosystem Study. So for those of you who are new to the webinar series, we'll be waiting until the end of the presentation to open up a question and answer session. You'll have the option of asking questions directly using your microphone, your headset, or you can type them in and we'll read them aloud. So I'm now going to turn the webinar over to Wendy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for inviting me to be part of this webinar series. I gave a talk last year as well, and I really enjoyed it, so when I was asked to do it again this year, I was really excited to accept. So today I'm going to be talking about how we can link maps, field data and models together using open source tools, so tools that are accessible to everyone. You don't have to have an expensive license or expensive software to do this. These are freely accessible tools in order to be able to assess our rivers, the health of our rivers. Just before I get started, I just wanted to draw your attention to the Heinz lectures that happened here in Fredericton and St. John last week. We were really lucky to have Christian Torgerson come from the USGS, and he gave two really exciting lectures, a public lecture and a science lecture, and talking about how we can use kind of these larger scale data, these freely accessible data, in order to assess our rivers. In particular, I draw you to the public lecture that he gave, and the webcast for both the science lecture and the public lecture will be available online probably in the next week or so through the Canadian Rivers Institute site. And again, I'd really recommend that you go away and take a look at those, because they were excellent talks and highly relevant actually to this webinar. So before I get started, I think I should introduce myself. I was saying to Darla and Michelle, it's quite strange being here on a webinar and not being able to see my audience, so I thought you'd like to know a little bit about me. I'm from the UK originally. I did both my degrees in the UK, and I'm a geographer by training, but I started to specialize in hydrology and geospatial patterns and aquatic ecology through my studies and my subsequent research. So I'm kind of like I sit at the interface of these different subject areas, which I think gives me a unique insight sometimes into how we can start to explore patterns and problems in natural systems. In particular, I'm really interested in looking at things across multiple scales. Often when we go out and take a sample, we have, we're at a site, we've got our head down, we're taking our sample, we're collecting information at that site scale. But what we also need to do is to, lift our heads up and look around what's happening in our reach, what's happening in, the kilometre of river that's upstream of our site, and also what's happening in the watershed that's draining to that site, because that's going to help tell us about what's driving the patterns and processes that we're seeing at our particular sample site. So that's my background really. So I came to Canada in 2006 to do a postdoc, and I've subsequently worked both with the Canadian Rivers Institute, and I've also taken a visiting research fellowship with Environment Canada. And I've come back to working back to UNB to work as a research associate on the Mactaquac Aquatic Ecosystem Study project that's up and running through the CRI. So in terms of my background, I'm really interested in kind of like the interface of this ecology and hydrology and geospatial patterns across both space and time. I'm also really interested in being able to develop what we call diagnostic indices, so metrics that we can use to kind of assess the health of our systems in freshwater. And more recently, I've become really interested in how we can develop environmental flow strategies. So if we have a river that's managed, how we can better manage the flows of that river to mimic the natural flow regime in order to, again, benefit the health of the system. So that's my background. So the question I asked you is, how do you use maps? It's not that long ago that, if we were going on a road trip somewhere, you make sure that you patch your road map, and, I'm sure at some point, if you're with someone, there'd be some argument about whether you were going in the right direction, or, oh, you should have turned left back there, or what have you. In recent years, we've got the development of freely accessible maps. Most people now have access to a smartphone or some kind of sat-nav in their car. So I'm not saying that the arguments have fully disappeared, but now we all shout at the sat-nav or your smartphone rather than necessarily at each other when you go the wrong way. So what I'm trying to say is this data now is incredibly powerful, and now you have access to this information almost in the palm of your hand. And I'm sure that we've gone to Google and we've typed in directions and they give you options and all this kind of thing. But we've all used this in order to get from A to B. Well, the tools that I'm going to talk about today are all using the same kind of processes that you get through Google. In fact, the information that we get through Google can also be used when we're starting to assess our watersheds too. So the question is, why are maps important? Going back to kind of BC times, these are some of the earliest maps that they have a record of from the Babylonian era. So people even back then were trying to see where they were in relation to other places in order to be able to communicate information. And that's the basis of a map, really. They're incredibly powerful because you can get that information on a piece of paper, or in this case a stone tablet, in order to give that to someone else and share that information and pass the information along. Even into, as maps became increasingly sophisticated, this is a map from actually my hometown from the kind of mid-1800s. And again, it's allowing us to get an idea of, the people who were there will be able to see, okay, I come here from A to B. But for us now, looking back in time at these historical maps, we can see how the landscape has changed. More recently, maybe we're interested in simply plotting our sample sites. Okay, well, I went out and I took a series of samples along a river reach. Where are they? How are they in relation to each other? If I'm doing a presentation or I want to talk to people and tell them about what I'm doing. Again, a map is incredibly powerful to show people where you are and what you're talking about. We now have access to increasingly sophisticated imagery, for example, through Google Earth. Now you can go into Google Earth and you have access to high-resolution satellite imagery of the area that you're interested in. We can also look at things to do with changing flow patterns and flood patterns, particularly with the satellite data that's being, collected on a daily sometimes basis or monthly basis. These satellites are continually collecting information, and that's information that's directly available to us through websites. So we can start to track, in our case, what we're interested in here is rivers, and how those rivers change over a season, over a week even, or over a year, and how they vary between year to year. We can be interested in what our landscape is like. We can take these digital elevation models and we can see, okay, well, here are my high points and my low points, and you can start to identify perhaps some of the driving factors in your watershed. We also might be interested in defining what the stream network is from that digital elevation model. So we can say, okay, here's my high points, my low points, where is the water flowing in our landscape? And this is the basis behind a lot of what I'm going to be talking about as we go along today. This is an interesting image here. This is the CRI 6 extent, and these images are created in the Arctic. So these images are created on a daily basis, and you can see the changes in sea ice over the course of a season, which of course has huge implications for other things within the system. It's just an example of a highly powerful area of information that, again, anyone can access and download. Another example here is where we can take our field data we've collected. In this case example here, we've had depth measurements collected along a reservoir, and then we can use our geospatial software to interpolate those. So we've gone from having point data here to having a continuous image here, and you can start to build up the picture of your landscape or your riverscape as it is here. Thinking at a larger scale, we can also think about the power of maps in terms of global issues. We've all heard this year about the Ebola outbreak, and I think these maps are incredibly powerful in showing the changes in the outbreak in terms of confirmed and probable cases of Ebola and how they've changed geographically over time. So this first map here is from the end of August, this is from mid-September, and this is now from October. And you can see the number of cases spreading and the extent of the spread and how that's changed over the course of this particular outbreak. And the World Health Organization and organizations on the ground use these maps and use this information not only to communicate to the wider public, but also within the organizations themselves to prioritize resources in what is, obviously a fairly stretched and limited capacity. So when we're talking about maps, it's not necessarily just at the small site scale or at a small watershed scale. We can talk about scales across, countries and scales like that. So where are we going in the talk? I've got two things that I'd like to talk about. First of all, for those who aren't familiar with the reference condition approach model, I'm just going to talk about that because the basis of the tools that I'm going to be talking about today all relate into the Atlantic reference condition approach model that we've been developing with Environment Canada and Protea. But the tools I'm going to talk about could be applied more widely. It's just my example is going to focus on this Atlantic reference condition approach model. And so as part of that, I'm going to introduce to you some open source tools that you could actually use to explore your own watershed, whether you're part of a community group or you're just an interested individual or a researcher or you work for a private organization, consulting company, whatever it happens to be. These are tools that anyone can access. And I think that the tools and resources that are available online, it's incredibly powerful, and it means that these tools are fully accessible to everybody. So just to introduce the reference condition approach model. So the way we have our watershed here, and we have our stream network. So within a watershed, there will be natural regional variations that are driving the patterns in the communities that we see there. But there are also natural kind of local variations within that watershed that are going to be driving differences in both the habitat and the biological communities. So we have a suite of different we took samples at these 9 different locations within the watershed. We would expect there to be some similarity between some samples, but also differences between other points in the watershed. And so what we need to do is in order to assess the health of our river systems, we need to be able to develop a model that will account for this natural variation across different scales. So what a reference condition approach model allows us to do is to put a sample that you take, let's say you take this sample here, allows it to put that sample into its regional context. It allows you to ask the question, okay, is this site similar to other kind of unimpacted sites within my watershed that are of a similar community type? It also allows you to say, if it's different, okay, well this then raises a flag. So maybe there's a potential impact that's happening at this site that isn't happening at my other 2 sites, which would have similar community types. So basically you can use it as a flagging tool that you can then go in and do further investigation. I was part of a group of people who helped develop this Atlantic Canada reference condition model, and we published a paper last year in Environmental Monitoring and Assessment, and it's freely available for anyone that's interested. But in terms of a brief overview, so we developed the reference condition approach model quite simply through this process. Within our region, as represented here by this blue circle, we identify a series of reference sites. So by reference sites, we mean sites that are minimally impacted, unimpacted if possible. We can't use the word pristine, so we'll say minimally impacted. So they don't have any kind of human stress going on within its upstream watershed or neighboring riparian vegetation. We look at the structure of those samples and we use them to group the samples by their communities. So we'll have, some group of samples will be dominated by particular taxa types, and that will help us identify these different community types. In this case here, I've identified 3 different community types, a red, a blue, and a white. Then what we do is we use independent GIS variables. So by independent, I mean that they're not impacted by any kind of human stressor. So we're talking about things like geology, and we're talking about long-term climate, although again that could be argued either way. We're not talking about things like, for example, percentage of agriculture within a watershed or the percentage of forestry occurring, because this is a human impact within the system. Then what we can do is we can bring in our test site, as represented here by our yellow dot, and we can extract those GIS variables that we use to identify these community types. And from there, for our test site, we can calculate what's called the expected probability. So it's the expected probability that our test site is most similar to one of these three types. So using our GIS variables, we can say that our test site here is 30% type A community, 45% type B community, and 25% type C community. So in the event that there was no stressor in that particular test site, so we've just gone out and sampled it, if there was no stressor in that site, then this is what our community should look like. And so we can visualize that here. And then what we do is we combine those three different ones, and that creates our expected community at our test site. Then quite simply, we go through and we send our sample off to a taxonomist who will then identify and enumerate the taxa within the sample, and we can compare what we observe in the sample with what we expect. And quite simply, the end result is that you end up with a ratio of observed to expected. And so the more that our observed community deviates from our expected community, then that starts to raise a flag that there may be a potential impact. Within the Atlantic Reference Condition Approach model, we use that approach, and we used a number of 170 reference samples and identified these community types, and then moved on to test it in various locations. We were very lucky because we had access to the CABIN dataset, that's the Canadian Aquatic Biomonitoring Network database, and that's fed through a number of partners, community groups, provincial and federal government groups, and even some individuals who all feed their data from their benthic samples into this amazing dataset, which allows us to develop these large-scale models, which wouldn't be possible without having access to that data. When we ran the model, we identified our independent geospatial variables. In this case, we identified long-term annual temperature range and also the relative area of bedrock geology types within our watersheds. So every time we now bring in a test site, we can delineate the upstream watershed of that test site, extract these independent geospatial variables, and then move forward to determine our expected community within that particular test site. So the question is how can we actually get that information that we need to apply a reference condition approach model in our watershed? It's all very well me saying, okay, you just need to get these variables, but we need to have the tools to be able to access those variables. And this is where QGIS comes in. QGIS is a fully open source geospatial platform, has highly accessible manuals for people who have limited geospatial knowledge, limited experience, but it also has, for those people who have a bit more experience, the information is there in order to be able to tweak your skills to be able to access those tools through QGIS. QGIS is an incredibly powerful program because it allows you to work with different data types. And it also creates data that are fully compatible with other software, both other open source geospatial softwares, but also proprietary softwares, including, for example, ArcMap products, the Esri product series. So all the information that you can create in here, you can share with other people, even if they're not using a QGIS platform themselves. But this program in itself is fully open source. You can go to the website and download it and be up and running within a couple of hours. I just wanted to introduce the platform itself. So there's quite simply a menu bar at the top, as you'd be used to. A toolbar. This part here is what we call our map legend or table of contents, and this allows you to list all the layers that you have in your project. And by layers, that just means the data that you have available to you in the project. And you can turn them on and off using these just little checkboxes at the side. The way that GIS works, whether it's a QGIS platform or even in the Esri products, is the order that these layers are listed in your table of contents determines the order of drawing. So if they're near the top, then they're going to plot on the top. If they're listed in the bottom, then they're going to be underneath at the bottom. And layers can also be grouped. So sometimes we end up with a large number of layers and it gets a little overwhelming. And it's good practice to be able to kind of group them into areas of kind of like common themes, for example. And the fifth thing down here is your status bar. And that basically will show you the current position in map coordinates, where your pointer is. It'll also give you a scale. If it's running something, it'll tell you like the progress that it's making. The plugin manager, which I'll talk more about in a second. And it will also give you your current project projection. Again, something incredibly important, which again I'll mention in a second. So again, this is a fully open source tool. What's really nice about QGIS is often a lot of these open source geospatial programs require a lot of coding, which I certainly find quite daunting, and it means that it's not as accessible to a large number of people as those who don't, if you don't have that experience. QGIS is a fully kind of point and click interface, so you can just click on the different menus and draw up the tools that you need. As a quick aside, I just want to make a plea about projections. So the question here is how we can represent the Earth's surface, which is of course not flat, onto a flat surface. And so for something like that, we use map projections, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And depending on which map projections you use, depends on how the Earth and the landscape is stretched in order to take it from being a 3D and flattening it out onto a 2D. This has been a long time problem. People have their favorite map projections. I'm not actually joking about that. People really do have their favorite map projections. And what we can do is, but each of these different map projections has advantages and disadvantages. Often the best thing to do is to work with a projection that's specific to your area, because of the way that projections work, where they kind of stretch and kind of twist a landscape onto this flat surface, then the best thing to do is to have your local projection, because then the areas at least will probably be as correct as possible, although there is some error. So the thing to do is to identify whether you're working with a geographic projection, for example, NAD83 if you've heard of that, or whether you're working with a projected projection. For New Brunswick, that will be the New Brunswick double stereographic. And just make sure you stick with it. Make sure any layers that you bring into QGIS or any other geospatial platform are in the same projection before you do any GIS work. Often one of the most common problems that I get for people who are working with GIS is they're like, well, things don't line up when I bring them into the program. And what it comes down to is that things are in different projections. So if you have them in the same projection, then everything will line up, and then you'll be able to do your analysis and create your maps without any errors. I also wanted to mention the plugins. One of the powerful things about QGIS is it works with plugins. We can think about plugins like apps for your phone if you have a smartphone. Basically, it allows us to access additional open source tools. So QGIS will give you a base platform with a series of base tools, but then you can add to these tools using this plugins. Examples include additional data layers, analysis tools, network tools, and display tools. There's a whole list of them, and you can add them to your QGIS, and then you can fully kind of interact with these plugins. I've got a couple of examples here. There's the Google Earth Link plugin, so you can create your layer within QGIS, and let's say you then want to send it off to someone else, and then you can basically export using this Google Earth link your information into Google Earth, and then you can send them that Google Earth link, and the people, your collaborators, your partners, other people within your community group, they won't have to actually get a copy of QGIS to do that. They can just use Google Earth. Another really interesting tool, I think, is this terrain profile. So you can take your watershed and you can draw your network line along your watershed, and then it will actually create the terrain profile of what the changes are within your watershed. So we can go into more detail now about what tools we can actually use to explore our local watershed. So what tools do we have available? I've broken it down into two kind of types. First of all, spatial tools. So we have our sample site here and our stream network, and we can quite simply delineate our upstream watershed. And that's one of the most important tools that we can have when we're looking at stream and freshwater analysis, when we want to learn more about our site. We can also, within our watershed, maybe extract values or particular areas that we're interested in. We can do a surface analysis, so we can look at, for example, changes in elevation within our watershed, changes in slope, changes in aspect, averages, however you want to summarize this information. We can also do something called zonal statistics, so we can take either individual watersheds or kind of components within our watersheds and run kind of smaller statistical kind of tests on those. And we can also do stream network statistics. So here's just some screenshots from some of those from within QGIS. So here, for example, I have my watershed, which is now outlined in blue, and what I wanted to do is clip the information from this purple layer in the background. So now I have two separate layers. This is my original layer, the bedrock geology, and now I have this bedrock geology clip layer, which is clipped to my watershed. So now I can start to run statistics and summarize that bedrock geology within that watershed. We can then not only produce, an individual kind of clipped layer, but then we can also start to explore that clipped layer a little more, and we can start to say, okay, well, for example, what's the total area of these different types of volcanic rock within my watershed, and it will sum the area of those different rock types. We could do that for any of the different layers that we have available to us. We can also, perhaps if you're interested in sharing information again with other parties and you want to look at, just show them how things change spatially, you can produce various diagrams in order to be able to, for example, summarize community composition across your different sample sites. It would be nice if we had a number of samples like this, sample density like this, but I mean, you could do it for within your watershed if you have multiple sample sites. You can do what we would call heat maps, so you can start to look, for example, at, in this case, total abundance within our samples to see if there's any kind of spatial patterns. Maybe you find that there is, greater abundance in a particular part of your watershed, and that might raise a flag. What's driving that, or why is it, more depauperate in another part of the watershed? We can also use tools where we can interact more with additional kind of data types. So in this case, these are my sample sites, and all I wanted to do is I wanted to extract the elevation at my sample site. And so I can do that, and then I can color my points according to those different elevation types. And we can also, again, take different components within our watersheds or multiple watersheds, and we can extract information about those. So in this case, we're interested in this column here, the average elevation across the watersheds within my sample site. So again, it's incredibly powerful. It used to be that you would almost have to do watershed by watershed or component by component basis, whereas now you can run multiple sites all at the same time, again, freely accessible through these tools. Other tools that are available that I think are particularly relevant to kind of freshwater analysis and exploration, network tools. So we have our sample sites within our watershed. We may be interested in the straight line distance between our sites. This is particularly important for things like insects, because of course they could potentially fly straight line distance between sites. But of course we're working with streams, so another thing that's really important is what is the stream network distance between our sites, particularly if we're starting to look at, say, changes in fish community and things like that. We can also be interested in what we call buffers. So we have our sample site, and then, like I said, when you're taking your sample and you look up and you look at the riparian area around you and even beyond that, you can start to kind of quantify, for example, different land use within different distances away from your sample site. And those sample buffers can be kind of, bullseye approaches like that, or you can actually tailor them so it's more of a reach approach, and so you're just taking, for example, a buffer on 50 meters either side of your stream. We can also overlay with different layers, and we can start to, again, extract information using those buffers. So just here's some examples. These are output from QGIS. So I have my 5 sample sites from my watershed, and I was interested in the straight line distance. And it will give you your table, and it will give you your output of the straight line distances between, in this case, my 5 sites. And the units will be in whatever unit your map has been set up in, whether that's meters or kilometers or miles and feet, depending on what you're working with. But again, what we're really interested in is, stream network distance as well. And there's a tool within QGIS that can do just that. So we can calculate the distance from point A to point B, and it will calculate it along your stream network. And again, it's fully accessible. Interestingly, this tool was actually developed for people doing traffic analysis. But I mean, the same rules apply, whether it's a road network or a stream network. The tools are still there and available to us. We might also be interested in, for example, line intersections. So we may be interested in the number of times a road crosses a stream, which could be critical, for example, for checking culverts, bridges, impacts of sedimentation, potential kind of point sources. And so here, what I've done within QGIS is every time a road in the black here crosses a stream in the blue line, then it just pops a red dot. And you could do that within your watershed or within your area of study. And you could calculate information about that. So you could calculate, the total number of times that happens, or the distance between road crossings and things like that. So what we're interested in order to get there, is how we actually delineate our watershed. So in order to get to that point, we need to understand how water, which I have in quotes, flows over this kind of digital landscape. So the way this works is we use what's called a digital elevation model. And if I step back a second, a digital elevation model is what's called a raster data layer. And all a raster data layer means is it's a series of a kind of a grid network like this, and each individual cell or pixel has a value associated with it. And so in my example here of my digital elevation model, I can have my raster. And for each individual cell, it has an elevation. Here's my example here. We can color code that so you can get an idea that these are generally higher elevations going through to like the lower elevations down here. And so what we can do is we can take a digital elevation model that's the size of your watershed or your region, whatever scale you're working at, and you can create these layers. But the base layer that you're starting with is this digital elevation model. So if we think about it, water is always going to flow from a high point to a low point. So in this case here, we have our cell starting here up in this top left corner, and it has an elevation of 78. Now, the way that this kind of virtual water flows over this digital landscape is slightly simplified, because it's going to all flow from that one cell into the nearest cell with the lowest, in this case, elevation. In reality, some water may flow into different cells, but this is a simplified version, and it works very well in terms of delineating a stream network and then eventually delineating your watershed. So in our example here, we have an elevation of 78 meters, and we look at the surrounding cells, and the lowest elevation is 67. So the water is going to flow in this direction from cell 78 to the cell with elevation of 67. And we can go through all the cells in this example raster I have here, and we can draw on the direction of the water flow, the virtual water flow across that landscape. You can already start to see that the virtual water is flowing across here, it's flowing from this direction down here, and basically it's ending up coming down to this point here, which you'll see here, or maybe you can't underneath, but that's our lowest elevation in our kind of example raster that we have here. And we can take those and we can convert them to compass points. So the way it works is on a simple compass. It's called the D8 method, and so it's taking the 8-point compass. And so it's saying, for example, the water here from this cell is flowing southeast. This one is flowing southeast. This one is flowing south, etc. We can color those. Again, it's just so you can get an idea of starting to visualize how that virtual water is flowing across your landscape. So this layer here is what we call our flow direction layer, and it's quite simply what direction is the water flowing in. So I'm going from the top all the way down to the bottom. The second layer we need is called a flow accumulation layer. So you can think about it as holding a cup right at the bottom of your kind of raster where the water is flowing out. and that's where the water is going to go. But you have to work your way back and see where all that water has come to. So it's going to accumulate at that point at the end of our raster where we had that lowest elevation. But the water, as we saw, has flowed from multiple different points. And as it goes along, it accumulates more water at each point. So what we can do then is you can start to say, well, there's no water flowing into this cell, so that has a 0. But we already identified that the water was flowing from this cell into this one, so it gets a value of 1. And this goes on until you accumulate all the way down through your raster, and you end up with a high value at the bottom. And this is the basis for your stream network. And this is another base layer. This is called the flow accumulation layer. And this is your water flowing out of the bottom of your raster. And from this flow accumulation layer, you can identify your stream network. So you can start to say you have a threshold from your flow accumulation layer above which you'll say, okay, this means it's definitely water flowing across a landscape. And from that, you can then start to identify a stream network. And this is how you can go from that digital raster, your digital elevation model, through to having the base layers that you need for watershed delineation, the flow direction, and the flow accumulation, and how you can go to developing your stream network. Now, when you run the tools in QGIS or another GIS platform, this is all done behind the scenes. You just say, I want to create these layers, and it creates the layers. But I thought it would be interesting for you to understand how these layers are actually created and where the information is coming from. So how do we actually go about delineating a watershed? We've created our base layers, and we've got our sample site ready. So what we need to do is we need to identify the sample site's actual physical location, its XY coordinate. And then we use a series of tools within QGIS that are called GRASS tools, which is actually an add-on from another GIS platform which fully integrates with QGIS. And we use those tools to delineate the watershed using those base layers I talked about, the flow accumulation and the flow direction. And these details are provided in the manual, which I'll show you in a second, which will be freely available online. I just don't have time to go through step by step all the processes right now. And so you end up, after you've run your watershed, we've managed to hit our sample site is here, and so it's delineated the upstream watershed for us. And you can go through and delineate a watershed for each of your sample sites, and you sort of accumulate them, and then at the end you can merge the final results together, and so you end up with, in this case I've got 2 watersheds, but as many watersheds or sub-watersheds that you're interested in. Basically, for each of your sample sites, you can go ahead and do this process. Once you've done that, and once you've created your watershed, you can then go back through and use the tools that we've talked about, and plus other tools that are freely available, for example, some of those additional plugins, to learn more about your watershed, more about your sample site. And really, once you've gone and taken your sample and had it identified, and you've got that data back, to help you understand what's driving perhaps some of those patterns that you're seeing at your sample site. As I said, these step-by-step instructions will be available soon. I'm working with Leslie Carter and Vince Mercier with Environment Canada to get the GIS component of this up and running online. But there'll be a website interface with the Atlantic reference model that you can use in order to extract the GIS variables that are needed to run the Atlantic reference condition model for your sites. But again, these tools that are in here could be used in other parts of the country to delineate your sites. So there's a whole section on here on the GIS variables, how you go through and delineate a watershed and how you extract the variables that you may be interested in for your watershed. So hopefully I haven't gone on too long. I just briefly summarize where I've got to here. So we've talked about the Atlantic RCA model. I've just talked very briefly about this open source geospatial program that's available to everyone, and provided a kind of a very brief overview of some of those readily accessible tools that you could use to explore your watersheds. And again, although I focused on the Atlantic reference condition approach model, there's no reason why these tools couldn't be applied in other parts of the country or the world. I also just wanted to do a quick short plug here for a 2-day workshop that I'll be offering in sometime during the winter or spring in 2015 on this open source program on QGIS, and focusing the tools that I talk about on this idea of it being kind of watershed exploration and being able to extract information about your watershed and your site. Just want to end up here with just some useful open source links. There's a link to the actual QGIS software there, and also some data sources that could be useful. A couple of these here are obviously New Brunswick specific, but I realize that there are geospatial data portals for the other provinces and territories in the country. So that's all available, and this is data that's, you know, publicly available data that you can just download. And again, if you have any other questions that we can't cover in this question period after here, feel free to contact me. That's my email there, so send me an email and I'll see if I can help. Thanks again.
Excellent, Wendy. Thank you so much. That was so informative. A lot of great information for everyone there.